Welcome to Surviving the Black Church podcast, where we shed light and bring awareness to religious trauma and dismantle oppressive systems within the Black church.
On this week's episode of Surviving the Black Church podcast, Jonathon, Hugh, and Nikki reveal one of their most important episodes yet. Has religious abuse become the norm in the Black church? Part 1. In this episode, the crew doesn't hold back their sentiments regarding the normalization of abuse and religious abuse within our community and the Black church at large. The normalization of religious abuse is insidious at its core, and many are suffering in silence or they fear being ostracized if they speak up. This episode sounds the alarm on how religious abuse has become the norm and how it has negatively impacted survivors. Please join us for this very important discussion. Take your time with this episode. If you have to pause or take bite-sized increments, then do so, because we are pulling back the curtain even more. Look out for the continuation of this topic next week. But for now, here is Has Religious Abuse Become the Norm in the Black Church? Part 1.
The Surviving the Black Church podcast represents the views and opinions of Jonathon Carrington, Nikki G, Hugh Kelly, and their guests to the show. The content here should not be taken as clinical advice. In no way does listening, reading, emailing, or interacting on social media with our content establishes a therapist-client relationship. The content here is for informational purposes only. And because each person is unique, please consult your healthcare professional for any clinical questions.
Hello, my name is Jonathon, and you're listening to Surviving the Black Church. And I'm joined by my co-hosts, Nikki G and Hugh.
Hey.
Hey, y'all.
Hey, so we are back for another episode. I have a question for you. Has religious abuse become the norm? Just want you to think about that question. Has religious abuse become the norm? This is probably going to be our most important episode out of all the episodes that we've done so far. And hang tight. We are about to go on a roller coaster ride. So, Nikki, can you share with us a little bit about what to expect on this episode?
Sure. Prepping to record this episode all day, I've just been, ruminating on religious abuse and particularly what it looks like in our community within the Black church. And I had a myriad of emotions from sadness to a little bit excited to be able to come and record this episode tonight, because it's been overdue for this particular topic to be spoken about, for the curtains to be pulled back. And I'm just going to be honest. This may be a very long episode. So for those who've been used to our hour-long episodes, sit back, get ready, get some coffee, get your drink or what have you of choice. And we're going to have to really dig deep on this episode. You're going to hear some things that may rattle your feathers. You're going to hear some things that may challenge what you were taught generationally. But we have to talk about the normalization of abuse in our community in order to help us get to the place where we can recover, where we can move forward, where we can start getting answers to the lifelong questions that some of us have held in silence, particularly when it comes to the abuse of pastors and what happens in the pulpit, what happens behind closed doors, the things that we were told, don't say, just pray about it. Don't speak on it. Just give it to God. we're going to pull back the curtains today, and we really, really want to be reflective. We want to ask some questions for ourselves and for you. So we're just giving you a disclaimer. This will be probably a heavy topic. So if you need to take breaks, do so. If you need to pause, if you need to rewind, if you need to take notes, do what you have to do that will help you be able to listen and take in the content for today. So just want to throw that out there. We're doing this not to cause people to feel dysregulated, but we're doing this because light needs to come in the areas that have been so dark generationally in our community and particularly in the Black church. So hang on, put your seatbelt on, and let's go for this ride when we talk about, has religious abuse become the norm?
Yeah, it's so true. And just in thinking about this conversation that we're about to embark upon, in broaching some of these topics about abuse and trauma, it is challenging and it's difficult for us to really sit down and really think about this stuff. But I just wanted to acknowledge and validate that, yeah, this is a highly sensitive subject, and we want to make sure that we provide support and we provide the information, because there's so many layers and levels to this. And I know that a lot of us, some of the topics that we're talking about in this episode may have been very difficult for many of us to really sit down and process, digest. But one of the things I want all of us, as we're kind of digesting and processing this stuff, to keep in mind that the relationship between being Black or an Indigenous person in America or anywhere and Christianity is very complex. And it's a subject matter that is context dependent. So we are speaking to all people from all different walks of life and all different belief systems, which is why we're approaching these topics with a sense of awareness and sensitivity related to the specific historical and cultural context of the subject matter. And I think that it's important that as we share this information, many of us were born into religion. We were born into it. And many of the things that we experience that has happened to us has been outside of our control.
Yes.
It's so easy for us to go into blame mode and to blame ourselves or to blame our parents or blame other people for what has happened to us. But I just encourage you to be compassionate, be gentle with yourself, be patient with yourself, be loving to yourself with the information that is passing through. And if the content is triggering to you, take some breaks, walk away, stop the podcast, stop the playing of the podcast, come back to it and rewind and replay if necessary, to come back to it if you feel like you're being activated or your nervous system is overwhelmed. So with all of that said, we just encourage you to take care of yourself, prioritize your well-being. And for this podcast in particular, we are discussing these issues to folks who their lived experience with Christianity has served as a source of oppression and trauma for Black Indigenous folks, rather than as a source of resilience and strength. I'll repeat that. Yes. We're talking about people who have lived experiences with Christianity where Christianity has served as a source of oppression and trauma for Black and Indigenous folks, rather than as a source of resilience and strength. That's important to understand as we are breaking all this stuff down, okay? All right, so I have a question for my co-host and myself, and we could talk about it a little bit. So when religious abuse has become the norm, so my question is, how have your own experiences with the Black church or your family influenced your views on what is acceptable or what is normal behavior in relationships and in community? Let's talk about that a little bit.
That's a real loaded question. How has our own experiences with the Black church or our family really impacted or influences our views? What's acceptable? What's normal? And how has that impacted our relationships? I mean, there's so many I could go into, but some that stick out, and I think we've talked about this in a couple podcasts back, about the marriage of love and abuse. That is a normal thing. Just a little love, just a little abuse don't hurt nobody. And we see this in our families of origins, and then we see this in the Black church where it is acceptable. So because it's normalized, because it's been accepted to some degree, we stay. We think this is all that life has for us. There are other experiences or thoughts that I come up with that question. One that has really impacted me a lot is about servanthood, about serving others first. And I am at the bottom of the list if I even get to myself. And I have an example of that both in my family of origin and within the church. You strive, you serve, you strive, you serve. And they found a whole bunch of scriptures to back that up, to make it seem like this is what God wants. All he wants to do is use us, be used by God. That is something to aspire to. But meanwhile, who we are, spirit, soul, and body, our basic needs are being left unmet, and we suffer. And so some of these things have really, there's more. This is a big one, okay? The perfectionism and how those terms that really are so toxic and really traumatic, this has affected us, kind of like, oh, just fake it till you make it, honey, that perfectionism. So we put the mask on and we just imagine that everything is okay. Meanwhile, we're bleeding inside. Meanwhile, we're holding on to secrets. Meanwhile, we know the abuses we've been experiencing and we keep coming back, but we have to put on this face and this facade because that is what is expected within our communities. Don't let them see you sweat, so that you have to hold everything together. And particularly being a Black woman, this is so true. Whether you are a PK, a pastor's kid, or you are the first lady, or you are the intercessor or the mother of the church, there is an expectation that you're not supposed to show your emotions and how you really feel. Everything has to be, I'm just fine, I'm okay. So I'll pause right there.
Yeah, that's good. It's really good. Hugh, what about you? What do you think of the question?
Wow, where do I even start with the question? I mean, it's such a, I'd say my experiences are pretty much within the Black church. In regards to the question, I'd say my experiences are pretty much the total sum of who I was at the time in my early adulthood and what I viewed as normal and acceptable behavior. Which means that, these very violent ways of being that are so predominant in how the hierarchy of the church, the hierarchy of Western, spirituality and how it operates, that was just a way of being. That was a way of, I didn't know another way. I didn't know what it was like to not be in these positions. I didn't know what it was like to not be abused. I didn't even know, I was just used to it. And at the time, I'd have never called this abuse, just because I was used to it, I would have never said that. And that's a really dangerous place to be situated in, because, you just really can never, this is an experience that makes you passive, so you don't really have an idea of where your experience, like who you are. You don't know how to move forward. You don't know your own power. You don't know your own, your own life and how that, you don't know how to move through life. And
Mhm.
so, these experiences, I never would have, again, like I would have never said I was a victim at the time. And I wish I did say that I was a victim, because then I would have been, it was too painful to acknowledge the horror of the futility and the passivity of not knowing another way. It was too painful to acknowledge that you were a victim. So you just, you stay guilty, you stay in these really modes of thinking that you're bad and that you need to do better and that you need to do, like you were saying, you need to do perfect, and the hyper perfectionism. So for me, I always think about the futility. It's the first thing that comes up in my head is, and the horror of not knowing how to escape that futility. And which means that abuse is just a way of life. It's just normal. You're just used to it. And so the church really reinforced these notions of, you are bad, you are guilty, you are sinful, you are decrepit. You need to put everyone else's needs before your own. You need to put the Lord above, you need to put Jesus above you. And Jesus could be, the usher that, is coming for your money every second, every Sunday, give more and more and more, and you don't have anything to give. So that's just what I wanted to, that question is there's so many different places to go with that question, but for me it's really about how abuse becomes a way of life, and not knowing that it's a way of life, and being
Yes.
confused by every thing that you think is supposed to be like, why am I being abused by a person who says they love me, right? As Nikki was saying, like, why? Like, it's just the confusion, the disorientation, and it's just life. It's, you don't know another way out. It's just normal. So yeah, I think there's so much to talk about on this topic.
Yeah. Thank y'all for answering it. I'm gonna be a bit vulnerable with
Go
y'all on
for it.
this, but I'm gonna go for it because I was thinking about this question, right? And I was going back to my younger self and the times when I was heavily involved in the church around, I want to say, like, what was that, 2012, 2011, 2012. And I thought about my younger self just meeting the first church member, because I didn't grow up, like, there's people who are probably listening to this that were born and raised in the church. I I had a Catholic
That's me
stint,
right
but
here.
I wasn't like what did you say, Hugh?
I would say that's me right here. I was born and raised in the church.
Yeah, and I think both of y'all actually
Mm-hmm.
probably were born and raised in church, but I wasn't. It came to me later on in my like in my 20s. But I didn't know, to be honest with y'all, like, I didn't realize how naive I was, right? Um,
About it.
in terms of like realizing that the reality for me was that I was going outside of my family system for spiritual support.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know
Mhm.
how dangerous that was. I didn't.
Mm.
I had no idea what I was even doing with just reaching out to someone that I didn't know, complete stranger, and asking them for help. Not asking, because in my family system, it wasn't. It was more about us being dependent upon ourselves for everything. We don't act, that wasn't the norm in my family system, to like, you rely on self. It was about self-reliance. And so it wasn't normal for me to connect to people outside or connect to anybody outside, but I did. But I didn't know anything about my sense of self. I didn't know that I was connected to someone that didn't know my soul, didn't know my spiritual, my walk. Um, I was naive. I didn't know what I needed or wanted. I didn't know how to express my needs or my thoughts or my feelings. I didn't know how to set boundaries. I didn't know nothing. Like, I didn't know how to how to even ask for help for what it is that I was experiencing, what it was that I was struggling. It was almost like I was so lost. And I was just kind of living life in this like aimless.
Did you know that you had needs? Like, I didn't even know I
No,
had
I
needs.
didn't. I didn't know. I didn't know that I had needs. I just knew that I was lonely. I knew that I was struggling in my family and I had nowhere to turn. Like I was looking for something outside of myself for external validation. So it was very easy for me to attach to anything and everything that was outside of myself. It didn't matter what it was. And so it was almost like, okay, give me your tired, give me your poor. And then that way I can use you, I can manipulate you and have you to do anything I want to with you.
Ooh.
That's how vulnerable I was. Didn't even realize what was even happening. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was in the right place. And then I realized just something isn't right about this because I feel used. I feel abused. I started to feel things, but that's how far disconnected that I was. So I wanted to share that because going back to the question of like, how have your own experiences with family or the Black church influenced your views on what is acceptable or normal? I thought that abuse was normal based on how I was treated in my family, how I was so invisible. I felt invisible.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't feel seen. I didn't feel heard. I didn't feel like, I feel like that was the only bit of support. And that's what we tend to do too. And, for me, it was about breadcrumbs. It was anything and everything. I just needed a little bit of love. That's how I felt about it. Just a little bit. And so I just wanted to say, because oftentimes, even just in Black churches or just in Black communities, it's like when you've lived your life in survival mode for so long, and then you finally meet somebody that gives you a little ounce of love, respect, appreciation. We stay with that no matter how it feels, no matter how you might perceive it, you stay with that. And so that's why, because I think, with just, what we're seeing right now with in the media, with a lot of church leaders that are verbally abusing and emotionally abusing people by yelling at people and people calling that the love of God, doing it out of love. And so we've become so hypnotized almost to believe that this is love, but it's really abuse. And that's the more and more you do that, the more and more you accept it as a norm. And so that's why it's so hard for us to name and identify and recognize and acknowledge that we're being abused, but it's coming in the form of the love of God.
Mm-hmm.
At what point do we start calling things as abuse?
But we have to wake up and see, and we don't even realize, like Hugh just asked you that question, Jonathan, did you know that you had needs, right?
Yeah.
And when you're a child, a lot of times we're not conscious of this. But when we're talking about abuse, we can be adults and we're still not conscious of it, especially if it's been normalized generationally, if it's been normalized environmentally in our families of origin as well. Like we're not conscious of it. This is why we're saying this episode is very important. It is, in order for us to wake up, we have to know we've been sleeping.
Mm-hmm.
How many times have you fallen asleep on the bed or the couch or whatever, and you didn't even know you fell asleep? You get up and you're like, I was sleeping.
You got the drool over your face. You got
everything. But you don't even know that you were sleeping. And that's how subconscious the abuse has been in our community, from sexual abuse to physical abuse. Now, obviously, this podcast is about religious abuse and religious trauma that follows. This podcast exists to shake up the table and to wake it up. so that we can, if
Mhm.
someone's sleeping and they don't know they're sleeping and they got to get up because there's danger around, what do you go and do to that person? You shake them. Does that mean you
Mhm.
don't care about that person? Does it mean you don't love that person? No, because I love, I will
Mhm.
shake you until you wake up. And so
Yeah.
this is why we're taking the task of having these difficult conversations that should have been had in our families 10 years, 20 years, 30 years ago. These conversations should have been had within the church after a 14-year-old child said, so and so abused me. These
Mhm.
conversations should have been had a long time ago, and they have not. And so people have been sleeping. Generationally, we have been sleeping. Now, this is not our fault. There's a lot of variables as to why we were sleeping. We can get into that a little bit more, but we
Yeah.
have been sleeping. And while we've been sleeping, abuse has been normalized. It's been tolerated. It's been
Mhm.
so much so that when our own says this happened to me, our first instinct for many is to not believe, is to suppress, to make it go away, to tell them to be silent. And
Mhm.
that is because we have been sleeping while the enemy has been walking
Mm.
around in our midst. So we talk about, I know that scripture, where the spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. But if
Right.
abuse has been normalized in our churches, is there real liberty or is it pseudo liberation?
Mm.
Real liberty is I am heard, I am seen, I am valued, I am safe. Okay, I am validated. Not
Mhm.
this, oh baby, what did you do to ask for it? All of that stuff,
Mhm.
we're here to shake it up and wake it up because
Mhm.
this has been going on too long in our communities. And the children's children are still dealing with effects to this day. So
Yeah.
I'm not yelling, I'm just passionate about this topic. So sorry.
Our
Yeah.
inner child is yelling at us to be
Yes.
passionate about this topic. It's screaming at us inside every day that we put ourselves, that I don't want to say we put ourselves, that we go through this and that we're not doing what we needed to be doing to heal from these horrific experiences. Our inner child is screaming at us every moment of every day when we do this. And so, yeah, I love that you brought in the child part at the end because we are still children in many ways. And so if we can reflect on that part of ourselves, I think it's really helpful for us to be able to move forward.
Yeah, I agree. And I just wanted just to add, thank you, Nikki and Hugh, for adding those points and in regards to the sleep, being asleep and being abused, because many of us have been sleepwalking through life, thinking that
Come on.
certain behaviors are normal. Oh, that's harmless, that's normal, that's okay, that's the love of God. And we use that within the context of because we are under a particular subculture or a culture or a community, whether we're Black, church, or whatever the case may be. And that's why it's hard to name and identify the abuse and recognize the abuse, because we say, oh, there's nothing wrong with it. It's God, it's God's hand, it's the anointing, it's this, it's that.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is a lack of an understanding and clarity that the experience that you're experiencing is abnormal. It is not normal. It is not healthy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what actually leads to people not reaching out for support. That's what leads to people staying in these abusive environments, in these abusive relationships, in these abusive settings, in these abusive communities, because you don't have the the ability to even, you say it's because it's culture, but it's not, it's abuse. And
Yes.
and also people who suffer from this normalization of abuse, they struggle. You might feel ashamed or guilty for speaking up. You might isolate. You might think that, oh, if you speak up, you're going against the community, you're going against the leader, you're going against. And that's and we're waking it up. We're waking
That's
up
right.
the silence of this, because this is what leads to people feeling a fear of speaking out against their communities or being ostracized or being rejected or being stigmatized by their spiritual or religious communities because they are is a feeling of going against the cultural norms or the expectations. And so we have to bring this to light.
Yes.
Because this has been going on too long.
Mm-hmm.
And the time is now, right? The time is now. And Nikki, you were talking about, the generations and how this has been passed down from generations.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's leading me because, people talk about generational curses and generational trauma, intergenerational trauma, patterns of trauma that's passed down from generation to the next generation. And that's what's leading me to the next question for us to unpack as we've talked about the normalization of abuse. Now we need to talk about the ways in which you might have been internalizing. And this is also for the audience,
mm-hmm.
for the listeners. What are some of the ways that you might have internalized patterns of trauma that it might be passed down to you, whether it been from your parents or your grandparents or your great-grandparents? So let's just sit with that question for a little bit.
As you're talking, I'm a very, what's the word I'm looking for? A lot of times I just see pictures and things of that nature when I'm talking. And when I'm listening to you, I was thinking about another analogy that speaks to this is being in a dark room. Mm. And when you're in a dark room for a certain period of time, your eyes start to get adjusted to the absence of light. Mm. And the longer we are in a room as a people in the church setting, with the absence of light to expose, I talked earlier about that perfectionism. Everything is fine. The image is perfect. I got my church outfit on. I'm part of the choir. I'm on the intercessor team. I speak at this conference. I don't mean me. I'm just giving a hypothetical. We have that image. And then the Black church at large, we can put on that whole mask, if you will, over the entirety of the church where everything is fine. But we are in that dark room for many of us. And we've been in there so long. And I'm not, a scientist or anything like that. But from what I know, the longer you stay in a dark room with the absence of light, the more potential you have to go blind. And so how much more if there's not one person in that dark room without light? Now we're talking about intergenerational trauma. How many generations have been sitting in that dark room with no light? And I know people like, I got the love of God. I got Jesus. He's the light of the world for those who are still part of the church. That's not what I'm talking about. Because I've been in churches, both Black churches and non-Black churches, where people were saying all those scriptures. They were getting the oil out. They were smacking their foreheads on people's heads so they can go down. All of that prophecy, dream inter, all that stuff was going on. All that activity was going on. But the people were still in a dark room with the absence of light. So just because you can quote a scripture, just because you can pull from your tenets of faith, just because you're very demonstrative in expressing your faith, does not mean metaphorically that people are not existing and families existing in a dark room with no light. Well, what's the light, Nikki? This podcast is a form of that light. The light is exposure. The light is pulling back the curtain and seeing what's been done in the dark. And I'm talking about all forms of abuse within the Black church. And again, I will preface what you said earlier. We're not speaking to every Black church everywhere. No, but we're talking and we're looking at the whole, and we're looking at it systemically, and we're saying, pay attention. Y'all can ignore it if you want to, but the volume has been going up more and more of people saying, I can't take this anymore. I have to speak. I have to share. I have to open the door so the light can come in. But what does it look like when it's just not me in that room, it's me and mama and them and daddy and them and grandpa and aunts and uncles who have had the absence of light and shouting and dancing and prophesying and pulling out scripture guns to judge other people. Yet we have been in that dark room with abuse all around. And what do? Baby, don't go to that door. It's too much light out there. We stay here. Let's just quiet this down. Let's be silent about this. Baby, you don't want to go against the pastor now. That's the man of God. We don't go against the bishop. You dare not put your mouth on the prophet. If you got an issue with the prophet, go to God. Keep it cute. Go to God, pray, and God will take away your pain. But don't you open that door and let the light come in. How are we supposed to heal if we don't name what has happened, if we don't see what has happened, if we don't speak what has happened? And because this is happening generationally, the effects of what is happening to us as a people, it's in our body, it's in the diseases and the sicknesses, I'm getting ahead of myself, that we are incurring right now. It's hitting us financially. It's hitting us in so many different areas, and not just us, but the previous generation and the new generation that's coming up. And we still want to keep the door closed because we have gotten used to the absence of light. And I'll just stop right there.
Ooh, Lord have mercy. Yes. I didn't mean to say that, but I'm like, wow. Woo. Hugh, you got anything for wow. I didn't let that sit for a second.
Yeah, towards the question, with the ways that I've internalized patterns of trauma that were passed down, man, where do you begin? So I would say for me personally, probably the level of guilty and shameful feelings I've been conditioned to have. But I would say the level of guilty and shameful feelings I've been conditioned to have about myself. I never really felt good about myself. I was definitely very depressed in my early 20s. And the way I learned to hate myself, and the way I learned to hate myself, and how everything was always an uphill battle from hating yourself. If you're starting from hating yourself, everything was just kind of an uphill battle from there. It was difficult to connect to people because it was difficult to accept love. It was difficult to be able to say that I'm worthy of that. It also made me a doormat, where I put everybody else's needs before my own needs. Like I was saying earlier, I didn't even know I had needs. I had no idea I actually had needs that needed to be satisfied, that I needed to be thinking about. So I was just kind of existing without knowing, without being nourished, without even thinking that nourishment was something that was even possible, without questioning the fact that I needed to be nourished every day. And so, if I didn't know I had needs, it made it difficult for me to ask for help. Like that was another thing that, was there. I couldn't really ask for help. And even if I did ask for help, it made it difficult for me to demand help from others, to expect support from other people that I was in close relation with, because I was putting everybody else's needs before my own. And so that really made it easy for me to be easily exploited and just sort of sucked dry interpersonally in relationships. I was used to it. I'd internalized that I was not worthy of anything. So let me give up everything. And it was coming at the cost of my own life. I had very hyper perfectionist tendencies. I was very much a workaholic myself. Like I worked in corporate sales and business development and tech. And, I would work insane hours. And when the pandemic first happened and I got furloughed, I inadvertently didn't work for 9 months. I maybe did Uber Eats for like a couple days. And it was the first time in my life where I had ever really understood like what it was like to not be in that constant motion, and what life could be if I wasn't always in that constant motion of having to do something. And so where do you even end to be honest, with what you've internalized. The list is just kind of endless of things that you've internalized. I don't even know where to stop. I'm just gonna stop there.
Yeah. I tell you, this is another question. It's another big question for me. And I think, in my younger life, when I was younger as a child, there were people in my family that warned me, about people in the world. They said to me, you can't trust anybody. You can't, nobody loves you. Trust no one. You only protect yourself. And a part of me was like, no, that ain't true. I was seeing the good in everybody. I was so resistant to the fact that there were abusive people in the world, right? Like I didn't see it. That's how naive I was. And I was like, nah, I don't believe this. I don't believe this. And then I would always get these reminders and I would like say to myself, I'm going to prove them wrong. I'm going to prove them wrong. And just when I thought, because I also had a thought that the church was filled with good people that were doing the right thing in life and that were ethical. And I didn't know until I was in it and I was seeing all of it. And it hurt. It hurt me. I can't tell you how many times I was left for dead in the pursuit of reaching out for help. Left for dead. And it don't take that much for me, it don't take that much for me. And so for me, I feel like the patterns that I internalize are like, I learned how to reach out to abusive people for help. I learned how to rely on abusive people for validation. I learned how to rely on abusive people for support. I learned how to rely on abusive people for a sense of purpose. Mm-hmm. I learned how to accept abuse. Mm-hmm. I'm admitting that to myself. I learned how to accept it because I didn't know. I mean, it was going on in my family. I mean, I was taught not to trust anybody. The world was dangerous and unsafe. I wasn't taught how to protect myself as a child. I was taught how to avoid. Yes. I was taught how to dissociate. Mm-hmm. I was taught how to be codependent on other people. And so that's what I mean by and some of these patterns were playing out in my family system too. And that's what you mean about when normalizing abuse leads to intergenerational trauma, because it's like, if you're in the family and you're seeing mama and daddy do it to each other, you're seeing mama do it to you as a child, you're seeing daddy do it to you as a child, and you say, oh, since they did it to me, I turned out fine. I turned out okay. They beat me. They spanked me. Mm-hmm. They hit me, and I turned out to be okay. Mm-hmm. You're not okay. Mm-mm. You're not okay. Mm-mm. Or they say, oh, that's just life. That's just the way it is. No, it's not. So it's like, all of these types of beliefs and thoughts and patterns are passed down. And then you're taught that this is the way that life is supposed to be. Yeah. So that when you go out into the world, you're like, okay, this is, since my mom and daddy told me to do this, this is the way it should go. Mm-hmm. And then you end up in abusive relationships, you go to abusive workplaces, you go to abusive communities, and that's all in the normalization of abuse.
Well, a lot of that also, we're sleepwalking. If we go back to the first analogy I gave, we're generationally sleepwalking because we are not aware of the abuse, which you just described. I saw mama do it. I saw daddy do it.
Yeah.
I saw the relationships where there was more abuse than there was love, but they were married. So I just figured they love each other. And then I sleepwalk into a relationship where there's love and abuse, but it's not really love, it's really abuse. But I haven't made that distinction because I don't really know what love really is. So I just keep going from one relationship to another. I'm talking hypothetically, but this is what happened. Generationally, we start to sleepwalk in abuse.
We are
And
unconscious.
we're not conscious. We're not conscious. And that's why I said we're here to get up. We're here to get the smelling salt out and saying, Black church, wake up, because this is happening far too long, far too often. And all of these things that Hugh talked about and Jonathon just described, we're trying to put Band-Aids over things that are full out gashes and wounds and need surgery. And shouting over it is not enough. Quoting all scriptures from all the books in the Bible is not enough. And we'll talk about that more in the episode next week. How do we cope with all of this? But we have to at least come into awareness and wake up and say, this is what's been happening. I got one to add to what you've already talked about, guys. Turn the other cheek, the forgiveness part, where I internalize. Forgive your abuser, forgive your offender. Don't even process your emotions and your feelings about it. Don't even ask questions. Don't have a conversation. Just forgive. Turn the other cheek. You know, you want God to bless you, don't you? Don't even talk about it. We don't talk about it because if you talk about it, then your feelings are going to get stirred up. If your feelings are going to get stirred up, you're going to start feeling. And if you're feeling, you might start saying something and the devil is getting into your tongue. And now you out of the will of God. So just turn the other cheek, baby. But mom, so-and-so did turn the other cheek. But mom, I just saw in the news that this person did that. Turn the other cheek, baby. Go to your abuser and tell them that you forgive them. Make the devil out of a liar. Go to your abuser face to face and say, I forgive you. Do it on television. Do it when they're interviewing you. Do it in front of the church and say, I forgive all of my abusers. Let's shout, let the church shout about it. Let's have a praise break off of that. And meanwhile, we are still bleeding 10 years later from the abuses we incurred in the church, from the abuses that we have incurred as a people. We're so quick to pull out the scriptures on forgiveness, but do we teach people and encourage people to feel first? Do we honor the victim and what the pain that they carried from experiencing that first? Or do we shove spiritual bypassing techniques in their face and dare them to do something different? And then put a stamp on that and say, if you don't forgive, God ain't letting you up in heaven, baby. This is what we're doing. Sleepwalking, living in that dark room. And we're tolerating it. And it's been normalized. And we're not talking about this enough. So this is why we're here. And so I have more, but I'm going to stop at that because forgiveness is a big one. I learned to just forgive people when they abuse me, not ask questions in relationships. Just allow things to happen. And I would come out the relationship later on, but I had all this resentment in me. I had all these questions. I questioned myself. I blamed myself. You know, I disconnected with myself. I didn't want to love me anymore because I thought I was such a horrible person. But a lot of that is because I didn't process forgiveness. I was taught so much. If you don't forgive, God's not going to forgive you. And so I focused on that, then focusing on the alarm that was going off in my body because of the abuse I experienced. So, you know, I'll just leave that right there.
Yes, yes. And you know what? Every time we forget, like every time we're in these abusive situations and we just forgive, we never forget. And punishing yourself and keeping yourself in pain and never acknowledging that, you know, forgiveness is not possible when the abuse is still so predominant, when it is still ongoing, when it's never been rectified, when it's never once said, I need to do the work of changing. You know, in the moment, it feels like it's something it's simpler to do, but it's a very cumulative process that plays out over time. It's extraordinarily insidious, and it will always catch up with you. And so, forgive yourself, because you didn't need to forgive you. You weren't broke. You weren't bad. To begin with, just forgive yourself. Move all that generosity that you are giving to the abuser and move it into yourself. So yeah, I love that piece you just said about forgiveness, Nikki, because forgiveness is such a weapon used by abusers. It is it is one of the biggest weapons that you'll ever, and you cannot escape this. It's right. And you turn on the news, and I don't watch the news anymore because that's going to that. But it is forgive. Somebody got raped and murdered, and the first thing they ask the victims' families is like, "Do you forgive this person?" I'm like, "Why? How could you ask? Exactly. Like, how could you think to ask somebody that? Like when they're like, it just doesn't make. It's such an illogical question. It's stupid, actually. I want to say it's a stupid question, and so yeah, I'm just going to leave it at that."
And you mentioned something. I'll just say this, and I'll pass it back to you, Jonathan. And we're probably going to have an entire episode in and of itself on forgiveness. So some of this may be mentioned again, but I think we would be remiss without talking about the topic of forgiveness and what that looks like for us as a people, and how we have been indoctrinated with this, like you said, this weapon of it being essential that we forgive in order to get our healing. I mean, they basically drummed forgiveness in our heads when we were in slavery, when we went through Jim Crow and all these other things, and the weight that we need to forgive that has been put on us as a people, and then it is perpetuated within Black churches. I'm not endorsing people walking around and just being angry and everything like that. I'm not anti-forgiveness, but I'm not pro-forgiveness without actually going through the steps of acknowledgement and going through the steps of acknowledging your feelings and processing a lot of the traumas and the abuses that we've been through. And I also believe, this is Nikki, I can't say this for Hugh or Jonathan, that forgiveness is not a necessary component in order for you to heal and recover. I know that may sound really foreign to a lot of people, but it's been pushed down on us as a people so much. And we have been under normalization of abuse so much that where do we have space to just be? Where is there time in this whole, on these topics that we're talking about, where we can just say, I hurt. I was wounded. I was traumatized. I was abused. And as soon as that rolls off of somebody's tongue, we're already giving them the F word first. We're already giving them the scriptures about forgiveness. Do we hear what people say when a victim comes forward and said, "This happened to me"? And as a church, we should be being a balm for those people who have been oppressed and hurt. But instead, people pull scriptures to invalidate the victim's experience. And this it becomes internalized. And then we grow up and we move through society and life believing that everything is our fault, believing that if anything happens to us, we don't have a right to feel. We don't have a right to share. We should just be silent. It's our fault. And I just need to forgive so God will love me. I'm sorry. I unlearned that beliefs a long time ago. I don't subscribe to that anymore. So I'm going to pause because I'll go on for 5 years about how forgiveness, like you said, is used as a weapon oftentimes in a lot of these churches to perpetuate abuse.
I'm going to say this, and I'm about to take it up a notch. Take it up a notch.
Take it up now.
Taking it up a notch. Okay. Forgiveness. All right. So, and this is going to lead us into some other things. But I work with people who have experienced some of the most horrific acts of trauma at the hands of other people. Okay. Trigger warning. I have worked with people who have been sexually abused, who have been raped, who have been molested, who have been sexually exploited, financially exploited, physically abused, emotionally abused, spiritually abused. Some of these perpetrators are family members, some of them are leaders of the church, and some of them are not. These traumas have had significant impacts on these people's lives, on my clients' lives and their well-being. It has destroyed them. Okay. The worst thing that I can do as a therapist, as a clinician, as a mental health professional is to talk people out of the way that they feel.
Come on.
That's the worst thing that I can do, to tell them, oh, they should forgive, they should move on. These are some of the most resilient and courageous people to be able to approach me for therapy, to resolve their trauma, to come to me to work through it. But they get caught up in that one point because they believe that they're supposed to forgive the perpetrator. They're supposed to forgive their abuser. And they get stuck right there because of somebody telling them, oh, they needed to forgive. They needed to forgive. Listen, if anybody is listening to this, and this is including my co-hosts, you don't have to forgive in order to move on. You do not have to forgive in order to move on. Do you hear me? Okay.
I hear you.
You don't have to forgive, because as soon as I say you don't have to forgive, there is relief. There is a release in that.
You can finally exhale.
Yes.
You can soften and you can release and you can exhale after being told that multiple times. Because in that moment, you are letting go of the power that the trauma has over yourself in that moment. And you open up the door to express and release the anger.
Yes.
Yes.
On you.
And any other rage. What was that?
You get to focus on you versus focusing on trying to forgive the abuser. When that takes rumination and all that other stuff, oh, I gotta do what I gotta do. You're trying. You haven't even processed your feelings. That relief is, I can heal for me now.
You know what? I just realized, just listening to this, like, I never realized how dangerous it is to even think about forgiving. Like, I knew it was annoying, right? But I actually think it's really dangerous to forgive, you know, a perpetrator of this abuse that has never come to reckon with what they've done. You know, I now see that as, like, you can't focus on yourself. You can't focus on your healing. So I just wanted to throw that out. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt.
You're right. It is dangerous. The brain and the body is very intelligent. Let it do what it do. Okay. It's important to allow that process, allowing the natural process, the body and the mind to do what they do to work through that trauma. You don't need to tell anybody or convince anyone to believe that they need to forgive anybody. Let the brain and the body do what it does. Okay. And I think that once we have determined that forgiveness is not necessary, then you can find a word that can be more congruent for the person in their trauma work, because it's not forgiveness. It's not forgiveness. And especially if you are a Black person, okay, in this country of America, okay, when we talk about historical trauma, forgiveness is not the word, okay? Because to forgive is to contribute to the normalization of abuse, the normalization of trauma. We as a Black race have experienced in our history, the most horrific acts of violence against our bodies and our minds. Systematic oppression, white inferiority complex, colonization, slavery, genocide, lynching, the list goes on. All this is affecting us individually, collectively. And not just that, we still have issues as Black Americans, poverty, discrimination, inequality. This has led to substance use, self-harm, suicide, risky behaviors. It has led to physical health issues, high blood pressure, diabetes, heart disease, HIV, chronic pain. All these things, it has led to mental health challenges, PTSD, depression, anxiety, mental health disorders. So when we use words like, we just need to forgive our oppressor, what does that even mean for us? You minimize who we are and our experiences and the experiences of our ancestors, the people that have come before us.
Yes.
We are justified in our anger.
That's right.
We are justified. So there is no one telling us that we need not to feel our feelings and feel our rage and our fury and our hate. Okay? Because this is what is contributing to all of these issues in our mind and our body, because we are told to suppress, to stuff down, to numb out, to dissociate, to block out those feelings. That's not our humanity. So as we reflect on historical trauma, we can't remove it. It's there. And it's still impacting us. How is it impacting us? How is it impacting our identity? How is it impacting our lived experiences? Or are we just saying, well, that was just a thing of the past. Oh, we need to move on from that. You weren't alive during slavery. You weren't alive during those people. Like that's what's being said to us about our historical traumas. So that's a question. Go ahead, Nikki.
Yeah, and meanwhile, we have all those effects you just named in our body, because when we don't speak and we suppress, where is the voice, the power of the voice, the energy of the voice? Where is it residing? It's still in us. And then we wonder, you mentioned high blood pressure, different cancers and diabetes and different things like that, autoimmune disorders, because that voice is suppressed. And we grow up and we're like, well, I'm out of it, so it got to be out of me. No, that is not true. If we have not touched it, if we've not acknowledged it, we haven't sat with someone to work these things out, if we've kept the oppressor's hand that comes with the abuse over our mouth, then it's still there and it needs to be worked out. But we're sleepwalking in this and we don't realize it. And so then we live in survival mode. And then we meet a relationship and we potentially get a career and we have a family and we go and we try to do something and have impact in society. And we are carrying these chains of historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, and religious trauma, and is compounded. And we're silent. It's not our fault. This is what we learned. This was a learned behavior. But this is why we're here to wake it up and say, we have to open our mouths now. Am I endorsing going in front of the church or the bullhorn and screaming? I'm not saying that's what you need to do, but hey, do what you got to do. What I'm saying is, I think what my co-hosts are saying is opening our mouth to ourselves first and acknowledging I am not okay. I've been the first lady with my husband in this church for X amount of years. And I'm just putting makeup on top of tears, on top of anguish. And I am not okay. I've been, running this ministry for X amount of years. And I've had all types, and I'm giving hypotheticals, but y'all hear me out there, right? I can name different stories of abuses, and we keep coming back every Sunday, every Wednesday, every Friday, and shouting and shouting and shouting. And we're not okay. We are surviving, we are existing, but we are so disconnected from ourselves. And now we're in survival mode. And it is impacting our identity. It is impacting our lived experience. Some of us, we don't know how to have boundaries. Jonathan, you talked about that. The naivete that you experienced. Same thing with me. We didn't know, I was not aware of, to be able to distinguish between someone with predatorial type of traits and someone who was safe. Therefore, I found myself in so many toxic relationships and abusive churches and cults because I thought, I didn't know to critically think. I didn't know to observe. I didn't know to question. I just saw, a light. I saw charisma. I saw, oh, they must be safe. They're a pastor. They must be safe. That's the prophet of the house. They must be safe. They've been going to this church for X amount of years. I don't have to think. I don't have to. Even if I did, how do I think? How do I determine if this is predatorial or not? I've had the example of love and abuse. So, hey, I guess this works. It feels familiar. And so wake it up so that we can see. We told you in the beginning, this is going to be heavy, but it's for a purpose, not to overwhelm and not to put a weight on, but to open the door so light can come in. Thank you for listening to Surviving the Black Church podcast with your hosts, Jonathon, Nikki, and Hugh. If you enjoyed today's podcast, we'd love for you to subscribe, rate, and give a review on Apple Podcasts. Don't forget to join us next week for another episode. Until next time, take care.